Welcome back to Foreign Founders. Naomi Goez is an operator turned investor based in New York City. She's twice an immigrant who grew up in Israel and then later in Canada. She began her career in supply chain within the fashion industry, initially in mature industries before moving over to the startup ecosystem. And today she is a principal at Foreign Ventures, a B2B SaaS early stage venture capital firm. I'm so excited to have her on the show because she's a huge supporter of immigrant and first gen founders in her personal and professional capacity. Welcome, Naomi.
Thank you so much for having me. So excited to chat.
Thank you. Would love to start off with what I said earlier about you being a twice an immigrant. So tell us more about your early life.
Yeah, let's talk about it. So, you mentioned this. I grew up in Israel. What you didn't mention is that I grew up in a teeny tiny community in the Galilee in the north. At the time, I think the population was about 2,000 people. So, you're thinking about a rural part of Israel. My household was very multicultural. So, my dad was French from a Tunisian background, my mom, Bulgarian Israeli. So I was very fortunate to grow in a fun mix of cultures and was very fortunate to travel a lot with my family. So from a pretty young age, was really passionate about global communities, really
Mm-hmm.
understanding how different parts of the world operated. And one of the ways through which I explored that at a young age was via fashion. I always felt like it was this universal language that surpassed a lot of other barriers. And so, via traveling and exploring different creative outlets, that's where I spent a lot of my time. Then, when I was about 13 years old, my family moved over to Canada. It was a career move for my mom. And at that point, like a very typical 13-year-old girl, just wanted to make friends. I just wanted to fit in. So I was really focused on just immersing myself in this new Canadian culture. We were in Edmonton, Alberta. It's the capital of Alberta. And all I cared about was just kind of fitting in with that group, which is it's an interesting age to move, but nonetheless, I think it worked
It
out
is
okay.
such a challenging time to move,
Yeah,
probably. And I totally understand. I think whenever I look back at my life and all my friends who grew up in so many different places, the part about fitting in is like so crucial, so important. And especially at that age where it's really hard to do that, or like you're not natural in some ways, you're like awkward in other ways. I
totally.
totally understand.
Yeah, totally. But I feel lucky. I mean, like, I think at the end of the day, like to your point, it's such an awkward age. And between the cultural barrier and the language barrier, all I wanted was not to stand out.
Yeah.
Which now looking back, I actually really lean into the fact that I stand out. And I work in finance, but I worked in fashion before. And I don't come from a world where my family discussed different asset classes. I actually had to explain to my family what I did for a living now, right? What venture capital was. So I kind of lean into being sometimes an outsider, and that is part of the reason why I think it's so important to you know go out and work with the typically labeled outsiders, because these diverse perspectives are what makes the world that I'm currently in so exciting and so dynamic.
Before we move on to like what happens next, you go to you move to the U.S. But what about fashion outside of the global part was really interesting to you? And I guess this could lead into what you do next with your career.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think at the younger age, when I was started to engage with this ecosystem, I acknowledged early on that it was an interesting mixture of movement in architecture and design. And that's something that, as a young person who was looking for an outlet, I thought it was a really, really interesting intersection of all those things. And as I grew older and became, as a typical teenager, became much more interested in self expression and a way to be an individual, but also part of a community, I thought that the fashion world did a really great job of creating that, right? Regardless of where you are in the world, you don't need to speak the language to be able to express yourself. And I think that that really fit in well with my family's passion for travel and my family's passion for discovering new cultures and new communities. And so that very much resonated. What I didn't expect to learn next is how critical the global component and the complexity of the global supply chain was to me, which kind of leads me to how I ended up doing what I did for a living. So taking a quick step back, I'm still in Canada. I got into business school for a university in Canada. I had an academic scholarship to go pursue that, and I almost, I started and I sat there in those classes, and I was like, this is not how I pursue a career in fashion design, which is what I wanted to do at the time. And so I agreed internally that if I get into the one school that I wanted to get into, which at the time was the only school that provided a co-op degree program where I could work for a brand but also get my degree, I would drop out, I would lose out on the scholarship money, and I would figure out a way to go to that school.
Yeah.
And that school was the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising in Los Angeles. And so when I applied and I got in, I dropped out of the University of Alberta, and I decided to work in the hospitality industry. I worked at a bar so I can make it all work, right? I was like, there's no way I'm giving up on this dream now, right? So worked for a year at a bar and saved more money so I can make this dream come true. And I ended up packing, I kid you not, 8 hockey duffel bags full of all
That's
the
so
things.
Canadian.
You can't make this stuff up. And I moved to LA, where I knew no one. I really didn't know many people in the US, let alone on the West Coast. So I kind of decided that I'm going to do the thing, and that's what really sparked this journey in California.
What's really impressive about that too is how early you realize the different opportunities that are available. Yes, you get a full scholarship for this, but this is something, the opportunity wasn't the most optimal for you, and then kind of going all in on once you got into FITM, and making that, and that's such a cool story to hear. Um, Through FITM, being in fashion, what were your first impressions? Is it exactly what you thought it would be?
Interestingly, and probably expectedly, it was not. I spent the next 4 years of college really immersing myself in every aspect of the business. I committed to getting an internship or a part time job in every part of the value chain. I knew I wanted to be in design, but I really wanted to test that out and figure out if that was the right place to be. And so I got an internship at a showroom, and I did some product development work, and I kind of tested out various aspects of the industry. But ultimately, I did get a fashion design job. And for someone who's wanted that since they're 6 years old, that felt like the dream job, right? I got to design outerwear. I was really excited about it. I remember I had like my own office space, and I really felt like I'd made it. And of course, as it happens, I ended up really hating it. And I realized that I was kind of bored. I didn't feel challenged in the way that I wanted to be. And the reason for that, and reflecting on it when I was about, maybe 6 months in, was that so much of what I got to do during my co-op degree and working and studying was actually more so on the business side of the industry.
Hmm.
And I realized that the inherent global and very complex nature of fashion is what I really appreciated about the business, and less so enjoyed the more traditional creative aspects of it. And so what ended up happening next is that I figured there's a pivot coming. And so I joined what was at the time a controlled asset by a Hong Kong based conglomerate that grew
Hmm.
through acquisitions of brands and licenses. It was a daughter company of the largest supply chain management company in the world of fashion, a 100-year-old supply chain management company. And so I view that as an opportunity to potentially kind of get in from a design perspective and slowly move over to supply chain. And I was very fortunate that I really kind of tracked down the head of production on the supply chain side of the business. And I begged her to give me data entry work. So I would stay really late in the office every single night, do my job, my day job, and then she worked late also. She is a very hardworking person, and I would knock on her office door and would just be like, "Do you have anything that I can help you with?" And the first few times I did that, she looked me up and down and she's like, "Go back to design. Like, you don't want to be part of this. This is not for you." And it is an unusual pivot to move up from design to supply chain production. So it really wasn't something that most folks at the firms had explored, nor have they in like kind of broader context of the fashion industry,
Mhm.
until one day she had stuff she could give me, and it was really like Excel data entry. And ultimately I was able to demonstrate to her that I was really serious about learning that part of the business. And I remember she looked up at me and she was like, "You really want to do this, don't you?" And I was like, "I really, really do." And I took one course on how to cost garments and I really want to learn more.
I love
And
that.
yeah, it was incredible. And I was so fortunate to find a mentor really early on who helped groom me into becoming a person who could take more ownership. And ultimately, towards the end of my time at this company, I was
Mhm.
overseeing over 60% of our manufacturing volume, after having been with them through an M&A, a bankruptcy, and then a take private by large private equity firms, including Blackstone, HBS, and Ares. So was very fortunate to live a lot of lives in that very short amount of time.
And with that pivot on the career, really getting understanding that going to the business side, is that what happened after? Is that when you went to take your MBA, or did you go to another startup?
So what I spent some time at this conglomerate for 4 or 5 years, and because of all the restructurings, I was able to absorb a lot very quickly, and really understand what consolidating supply chains of multiple assets looked like. Beyond that, I was really fortunate to spend a lot of time at our factories and on our warehouse floors. And I
Yeah.
was tasked with a lot of initiatives that required a lot of data, required a more meaningful tech stack than was available to us. And that actually catalyzed a new obsession. Before I even thought about startups, I
Yeah.
realized that so much of what I was excited about at work had nothing to do with the product I was shipping of apparel. It had
Yeah.
everything to do with this intersection of business optimization and digitization and accountability.
Yeah.
And so that propelled this new engagement with that specific intersection in Los Angeles.
Hmm.
And this is when I also realized that immersing myself in those types of communities was a really big unlock. So I ended up in my free time volunteering at a Los Angeles based charitable organization that was supporting founders that were building at the intersection of sustainability and commerce. And it was a lot of ad hoc project support. We looked at some decks. We helped them think through customer awareness and building brand awareness. Did multiple community engagement events. Um, and simultaneously, because I was so involved in the ecosystem, I started posting about it on social media, about my own journey and about what it meant to be a conscious consumer. Um, and fortunately, that led me to a path of building a micro influencer platform on Instagram, where I had an audience that was highly engaged in that really specific sector. And this
Hmm.
is in 2018. I think that the conversation was much more in its infancy at the time than it is today. But really, we were still like kind of the oddballs of the fashion industry, talking about apple skins and instead of leather. And
Yeah.
so through all of that, I was able to learn a lot more from people who were already building in it. Um, I was then asked to go back to my alma mater to actually teach a course on this. And so it wasn't a course that was available to me when I was a student, and I felt really passionate that it should be part of the core curriculum. And
Hmm.
so was able to go do that and kind of give back to the community that helped me get to where I was. And more and increasingly I was spending time really trying to understand what the impact on global communities of that fashion supply chain was, an impact that is very much disproportionately negative towards the people of color, women that were engaged in those supply chains. And via all of that, one of the biggest takeaways was there's this massive opportunity to digitize legacy industries that touch supply chain. So when you think about transportation, distribution, warehousing, these are all these archaic worlds that relied on very disjointed old school operations that didn't talk to one another. So there's no meaningful data collection. And therefore, it becomes much harder to establish a roadmap where you can track progress, right? If you don't know where you
Totally.
started, how can you track where you're going? And
Totally.
so that was kind of the beginning of the end of mature industry for me, where I saw that there are a lot of barriers to driving impact across this type of innovation. And around the same time, another mentor of mine was starting a circular economy startup. And
Mm-hmm.
she needed some support around supply chain. So that's how
You
I ended
raise your
up.
hand again, and that's your start of the startup journey.
Exactly.
Um, let's go into where you are today with Form Venture. Being an operator and being an investor is completely different, right? Even though you had these moments where you were seeing opportunities, being like, I can really, we can optimize around these like tech stack, improve efficiencies, improve sustainability, and access to that. So you've always had that like investor or like where things come into the future mindset. But how do you make that transition?
Yeah. So as an early stage operator can attest, sometimes you're joining with one work function in mind and you get thrown into other work functions. And so classically, that happened to me too. I was joining to support the supply chain setup for this circular fashion brand. But the founder was at this intersection of needing additional capital and exploring venture and angel financing as the route. And as a person who knew nothing about this, she needed some support, and I wanted to help. And so I kind of got thrown into understanding the infrastructure of what it even means to engage in these conversations. What are the resources that one needs to have, and what do you even present? How do you engage in these conversations to begin with, or get into the rooms? And so that was a really eye-opening experience, just from a pre-seed fundraising perspective, on what that looks like as a person who's never seen it before. And so initially I was obsessed just with the innovation piece, but then I also learned about the complexity of fundraising and how difficult it is for someone who doesn't come from this world, who the person I work for is another woman. And so the two of us navigating these male dominant, really specific profiled rooms was the first time that I realized that there's another gap that I'm passionate about solving. And that's getting the types of businesses that I was excited about the right capital to propel their growth. And so with those two really big things in mind, I was like, if these are two areas that I want to drive impact in, what do I need to do? I was like, I have to broaden the scope of my work. And so I went back to school, and venture was one of the areas I was excited about exploring, having seen how hard it was and how opaque of a world it was. And so I wanted to demystify it initially just for me, but when I realized how many obstacles are present for people with much less privilege than I have, all the obstacles that they face going into those rooms, I realized that there's actually a really big opportunity to drive the impact that I'm excited about, which is how I ended up here. So you obviously shared that in my intro. I'm a principal at Forum Ventures. We
Mm-hmm.
are a B2B SaaS multi-strategy fund. So we actually have three investment vehicles. One is an AI venture studio. The second one is an accelerator program. And the third one is a pre-seed fund. So we're really able to invest at the earliest stages, double down over time. And our check size goes between 50K and 50K, kind of depending on the round dynamics. So I'm really able to zoom out of my immediate lens of operating in a really specific capacity and think about multiple sectors and supporting founders across multiple areas and navigate some of the challenges that I firsthand experienced when I was sitting on the other side of the equation.
And so Forum has these three different vehicles for investing in startups. Do you do you invest in the fashion supply chain B2B world, or as a principal, are you able to invest in so many like different types of verticals or product or industries? How does that work?
So we don't have sector ownership around the investment team.
Hmm.
So we all look at everything and invest in everything, which has been really fun and a great way for me to learn also how to broaden my investment lens. With that said, as a firm, we have a few areas where we spend a little bit more time in terms of our thesis development, network engagement, and being more
Yeah.
proactive around portfolio exposure. One of them is supply chain, which I am thrilled about since I'm able to practice a lot of what I've learned as an operator. And then the rest are healthcare, applied AI, AI infrastructure, vertical AI, and fintech, alongside others. So, on from a firm perspective, you'll see that we publish a lot of these types of works. And most recently, we
Hmm.
launched a healthcare report that I had the pleasure of co-authoring with our CEO, Michael Cardamone.
And this is a perspective that was really helpful for the foreign founders community. Is early stage founders who are potentially building in B2B enterprise products. What are some of the green flags and red flags that you've seen, especially from, let's say, immigrant founders, first gen founders, underrepresented founders, that you can highlight here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it really all starts with doing your homework. And you'd be shocked across the board, regardless of background, how many decks and messages I get from people who are building in completely irrelevant sectors to where I spend my time. And
Yeah.
so when I work with early stage founders, especially first time founders, folks who've never engaged with the ecosystem before, I really talk about things that are seemingly basic, but most people actually don't think about or don't do. And so beginning with the understanding of fund thesis, right?
Hmm.
What is the fund invest in? What is their check size? What are the profile of investments that they have traditionally made bets on? So are you reaching out to an investor that's investing in the sector in which you're building? Does the check size that they write, does that fit your round dynamics? Those are some
Hmm.
really foundational questions that one can ask themselves. Now, from a lens of those who are representing maybe non-US geographies, there's an additional layer of early diligence that is really important to understand and explore. And that's really understanding the investor's point of view on investing in multiple geographies. A really good way to do that is just look at their portfolio. Have they invested in the geography that you are representing? Have they really bet on those founders? And so once you have a good grasp of those things, that's when you can be very intentional around your outreach. So the biggest green flag to me is when someone comes to me with their intention saying, "Hey, I've seen that you've invested in blank.
Hmm.
I'm developing a product in a similar space or an adjacent space that I think would really complement the portfolio." And
Hmm.
that is the type of mindset that one needs to develop when thinking about how to get into those rooms, which takes a lot of intentionality, but is actually really doable once you have a good grasp of the investment lens.
Hmm. Yeah. I, I'm shocked but not surprised that you get really irrelevant pitches as well, because I feel like a lot of the times people think it's numbers game and just getting their like hitting their numbers as much as possible, but it's also the quality of engagement as well, even if it's cold engagement. And
100%.
that's doing the work or doing the homework is like really important for that.
100%.
Um, you mentioned earlier about democratizing information about building great companies. Um, how do you, how does Forum or how do you help or founders do that?
Yeah, so I really do think that it all starts by really deconstructing what an investor needs to have answered, and what does the investor memo actually look like? And so the way that I really like to do it, and I currently engage with different school communities, different accelerator communities that are actually targeting first gen and immigrant founders. So I walk through the investment framework. And that to me is a great way to equip aspiring founders or early stage founders with the right toolkit to drive meaningful and very productive conversations once they're in the room. And so, like many other pre-seed investors, my evaluation framework follows the founder market product framework, where we're really thinking about the founders first, then we're thinking about the market, then we think about the product. Now, the reason for that is because at the pre-seed stage where we spend our time, is that there's often either not a fully ready product, and even
Right.
if there is, it's very much safe to assume that there will be an inevitable pivot or two. And
Right.
so we want to make sure that what we're underwriting is the ability of the founder to navigate the challenges that they're setting out to solve and execute on that mission, and that the
Hmm.
market is large enough to create a venture scale outcome. Now, what I find really exciting when you think about the founder profile, which I'll double click on in a minute,
Hmm.
is that I think the immigrant mentality has a strong right to win. And so something that I read recently is the unicorn founder DNA report by Defiance Capital. And so
Hmm.
they walk through different statistics that are associated with the founder makeup and composition of various unicorns in the market today. But what struck me as really unique was their list of three dominant factors that are common across that DNA of a unicorn founder. So the first
Hmm.
one is having no plan B. The
Yeah.
second one is having a
He
chip on
burned the boat.
exactly. Um, the second one is having a chip on their shoulder.
Yeah.
And the third one is having unlimited self belief.
Hmm.
And so, and beyond that, they said that most of the founders that they spoke with also had a personal story of feeling unfairly treated or feeling limited in their native environment. And
Hmm.
so classically, that fits the immigrant stereotype. And
Right.
apparently, these are some of the foundational elements of what makes for a really successful, resilient founder. And so when you think about it, across all the complications and the rigorous requirements of just getting to A status in the US,
Hmm.
immigrants face significant challenges and have to navigate them by exhibiting very uncommon tolerance for risk and adaptability. And
Hmm.
so when I think about beyond the investment framework on a memo, when I think about what are the core characteristics of a really successful founder, well, now we have it from a data perspective that the classic immigrant founder actually has all of those. And so I always love kind of thinking through that, because there are so many parallels between what we've seen leads to success and what is required of an immigrant or a first gen person to build a business and get financing in the US. And so, from that perspective, I thought that report was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. Um, I love that as well, and it's something that, for example, there's a stat where it's like 65% of companies for Fortune 500 are all founded by immigrant founders. Um, we see that, but one of the most important things that I want to do with foreign founders is to tell more stories around immigrant founders, so people can see the data, but then they can also hear the stories or see the face. And yeah, I agree. I think those are uh, strong qualities for an immigrant founder. One of the things that I feel as though is a challenge, especially from a fundraising perspective, I recently wrote about the founder of Postmates, so Bastian Lerman. He was saying in the very beginning, it was very difficult for him to fundraise because culturally, let's say Bastian grew up in Germany, He was like, culturally, we were not boastful. We're very, conservative about our numbers and projections and all these things. First, do you see that across the founders that you like, let's say immigrant or first gen founders that you interact with? And one of the things I hear often is whenever I have conversations like, how do I get better at fundraising? Um, so I would love to ask you about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't have any hard stats from my personal experience, but anecdotally, I can confirm that I've seen folks that come from other geographies, and particularly women, be more conservative and lead with a lot more classically um, humble
Hmm.
approaches, which is not necessarily what we tend to see in our traditional VC founder type. So I can certainly sympathize, and that resonates. In terms of what are some tactical things that one can do, I always like to separate into two parts, right? One is how do you actually get in the room, and two,
Hmm.
you got into the room, what do you do next? And this is part of the workshops that I mentioned that I conduct with these types of audiences. And so the way that I think about it, first, you've done your homework, you know who the firms are, you have a list, you have a target list. How do you get to them if VCs notoriously love to invest in their network? There are a couple
Yeah.
of ways to crack that, right? So the first thing that I encourage founders is to think about the broader startup ecosystem. There are a couple of ways to get to VCs. One would be through their own founders in their portfolio, and another one is ecosystem partners. And so, say you are building an X space and there is a portfolio company of an investment firm that is on your target list that resonates, that has done something that's really inspired you. Developing a relationship with that founder and ultimately using that as a warm introduction to the firm is
Hmm.
a very productive way to get in front of an investor. Investor loves to take references and reference calls from their own portfolio. And so
Hmm.
by engaging with founders, that should also already be a helpful practice for founders, right? To engage with others, you're actually able to unlock access to those rooms, to these investment rooms. Another way to do it is actually engaging with other parts of the ecosystem, not on the founder side, but actually on the
Hmm.
service provider side. So oftentimes at tech events, those are sponsored or hosted by law firms, by service providers like Brex or Ramp or Trinet. And
Yeah.
so the people who are in those rooms hosting the events are connected to multiple nodes of the VC and startup ecosystem. And so developing a relationship with them can be a very productive way to, again, get those warm introductions. So those are a couple of ways where you can avoid having to do cold outreach and
Yeah.
potentially get a warm email. That doesn't always work, right? Maybe you live in a city where the tech ecosystem is not as engaged. And so just going to happy hour is actually not that trivial. And so in those cases, I actually do think that there is a way to do really meaningful and personalized cold outreach. And that goes back to what you know of the firm. VCs notoriously love to talk about themselves. There's a whole Twitter feed that is all about VCs congratulating themselves. And that's for a reason, right? We
So
all
good.
lean into that stereotype. We
Yeah.
love to talk about our investments. We love to talk about our thesis and our market
Hmm.
maps. And so a lot of that information is extremely public. It's available on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on the firm website. And so via engagement with that type of content, and a founder is able to find a way in. And you'd be surprised, we actually signed several companies into our portfolio that came specifically from market map submissions. So I posted that
Oh,
I created a certain market map,
yeah.
and I said, if you want to be on this market map, if you're building something in this space that's applicable to this, feel free to leave your information here. And it was really just a Google form, and we ended up signing a couple of founders into our portfolio just from that.
Wait,
And
that's
that is,
super cool.
it's incredible. And
Yeah.
again, it's mutually beneficial. I was actively looking to learn about a certain space, and I wanted to
Hmm.
learn about who was building in it. And of course, the founders wanted to get on a market map. That's a great marketing tool. And it ended up leading to something much bigger than that.
Yeah.
So that is something that I'm a big advocate for, and I think is really important for founders to keep in mind. All of this stuff is public and very easily accessible.
So many great lessons, so many tactical advice. We're coming to an end to the episode, but are you ready for the last couple questions?
Yes. I also realized that I didn't touch on what to do once you're in the room, so I can quickly
Oh, yeah,
double click
let's do
on that,
that.
or
I
we can
totally
just
forgot
remove
about
that
that too.
part. So you got in the room, you got that first meeting. What do you do? This is where understanding what I, the investor, need to
Hmm.
put in writing, need to build a case for an investment in your startup becomes really helpful. So going back
Hmm.
to that framework of founder, market, product, what are the questions I'm actually asking myself and what am I optimizing for? So when it comes to team first, I love to invest in folks that have meaningful founder market, founder product fit. What that tactically
Hmm.
means is people with true domain expertise who have previously engaged with the problem that they're looking to solve and have a nuanced understanding of the value chain, right? The people they're going to sell the product to and how different parties in the value chain would interact with their product.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, these are people, because of their domain expertise, they come from that world. They tend to have an unfair network advantage, right? They have some sort of distribution advantage that will not only help them develop the right product, but will also
Hmm.
help them sell the product and scale the business. So, those are some of the high level questions that I ask about the founders or want to learn about the founder, alongside,
Yeah.
other aspects of coachability, ability to execute. What are some markers in their profile that show me that they can set a goal and really go after it, right? If especially if they've never raised before, how can I
Yeah.
find other proxies on their resume, to really underwrite their ability to execute? Then I move over to the market. And I mentioned this earlier. Obviously, we love a big market. We need something that will sustain a venture scale outcome. So I'm really thinking about some of the tailwinds in the market. What does the competitive landscape look like? Does this founder have a meaningful wedge or differentiation in that landscape
Hmm.
that will allow them to grab some market share? And is what they're building recession resilient or down market resilient, right? Is it a must have or is it a nice have? And that
Right.
is what propels us to think about the product and really think about what the IP is, what is the product's right to win, and if the product pivots, right, like what are some other avenues that they could consider. So obviously it goes in a lot more detail than this, but if you're a first time founder going into that room, understanding that framework and what are some the high level questions that the investor wants to answer, you can be a lot more proactive in providing that information, or better yet, leading your presentation with a lot of these markers so the questions don't even need to get asked.
I feel like there's a lot more we can really like dive deep into that once you're in the room and then break down these things. And that's also an invitation for the future, Naomi, for you to come back on the show and we can just double down and focus on that. Um,
Totally.
but yeah, I would love to ask about a couple of the, maybe fun questions I found because I saw your investor lens when in one of like the live recordings, YouTube, you were analyzing nasty gals, and you said, like that business is super hard because you have to buy materials like ahead of time, invest all that, and then you get paid back like 90 to 120 days later. Um, for founders who are starting in that space, do you have any advice on how to operate?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll actually start with a quick anecdote that is, I think, a helpful orientation for what we're seeing that sometimes doesn't work. Um, Often we'll see incredibly technical, talented first time founders really focus on the product that they're building and building the best product they possibly can, and lose track of their distribution, not be
Hmm.
as customer obsessed, not iterate with the customer. And so taking that understanding and that type of very common pitfall and applying it to what do you do when you're approaching this very intimidating business model that is potentially going to be extremely capex heavy. I always go back to, do you really understand what that customer wants and what is their willingness to pay is? So my biggest advice to anyone going into any of that type of building is that once you have identified the problem and you have an early version of whatever product it is that you're selling, start selling it. Don't
Hmm.
wait until it's perfect. Don't wait until you have a whole line and that you paid a bunch of inventory for, right? Start testing out the market and see what they're receptive to and
Yeah.
iterate quickly as you get answers. So being extremely adaptable and data focused on what the market is telling you is the way to unlock a lot of that growth and avoid falling victim to having maybe the most intricate product, intricate line that has no customers wanting to buy it.
You said something along the lines of like conscious consumerism being a trend in fashion and consumer ADD as well. Do you see that same kind of trend in the B2B world that you work in today?
Not as much. I wonder if some of the trends are just like not as applicable in the
Yeah.
B2B world, particularly because sales cycles are really different, right? The willingness to pay for certain things is different.
Hmm.
What is interesting to see is there is a lot of innovation and rates of adoption vary kind of depending on customer segments. And so
Hmm.
from that perspective, that's when we start to think about retention and how sticky different tools are. And that is part of what we look to understanding our due diligence is how sticky is a product, or is the customer going to abandon this product the moment another product comes on the market that's only maybe marginally better.
I always love to close the episode with what are you optimistic about? I think this is a really fun question just to get understanding from, operators, investors, founders, and especially immigrants. I feel like founding a company or working with startups is a very optimistic act, but doing it as an immigrant is like 10x, 100x that. So I would love to finish with what are you optimistic about?
It's such a great question. And I think there's so much to be optimistic about, right? So going back to that one report that I mentioned, and you mentioned the stat, 62% of the unicorns that they looked at had a either immigrant first gen or second gen founder. That to me was such a great stat to see. It's a report that was released only a few months ago. So the data is fresh and accurate. And so that's really exciting. I think
Hmm.
from an ecosystem perspective, there's so much happening. We're seeing more firms with dedicated theses to support immigrant founders and first gen founders. And oftentimes, these firms offer beyond just capital. They offer services around immigration and legal resources, different market readiness workshops. And so, a few that come to mind here are Unshackled Ventures, One Way Ventures, First Gen VC, Dream Venture Labs, Weave Acceleration, to name a few. And it's so
Hmm.
fun for me to engage with them, right, and support their founder audiences, but also to see the growth of that type of investor in the ecosystem. And then, moving over to the regulatory part, it's fun to see that there are some tailwinds there, right? There's some things that are parallel to immigration and first gen, but California, for example, last October passed a bill that would require VC firms to actually report on the numbers of investments that they've made in diverse founders. And that's going into action in 2025. And so I think that from a broader, just macro perspective, we're seeing a forcing function to look
Hmm.
at more of those types of founders, which obviously will help propel, hopefully, immigrant and first gen founders to get some funding. And then finally, kind of in my own little bubble, I know that we talked about how VCs notoriously invest in their own networks, and there's a massive power associated with a warm intro, which definitely
Hmm.
holds true, but there's also a flip side to it. And recently I read a book called The Venture Mindset, and they talked about something that was really interesting. It was a statistic or a study that they did around cold inbound experiments. And they
Hmm.
found that 1 in 12 emails of fake cold inbound actually got a non-trivial response, right? Like a non-automated, like a meaningful response. And 75% of those were asked to get on a call or generated or triggered some due diligence in some capacity. So that
Interesting.
statistic was really meaningful because I think we constantly talk about how do you get in the room? How do you get an intro to an investor? And I don't know that we discuss enough how powerful that cold inbound is, which to me inherently is a way to break barriers to entry.
Yeah.
And I feel very fortunate to share that Forum is very much celebrating and establishing that breaking barrier to entry approach by encouraging cold inbound from founders. And we make that really easy on our website. We all check our LinkedIn and our emails for these types of inbounds as well. And so what's most exciting is to see those types of barriers where if notoriously you could only get in if you knew somebody, now you can get in without knowing anyone. And that to me is the most hopeful realization to kind of leave this narrative on.
I love that. I didn't know that stat, and that is such a great way to end the episode. Um, how can people who are listening or founders reach out to you or Forum Ventures? Obviously, we want them, if they're asking for investment, to do the research first to make sure that Forum is the right fit. But where would you like to take them?
Yeah. So, two really easy ways: connect with me on LinkedIn, send me a message. Or another way would just be go on our website. We have a button that says pitch us. Send us your pitch. Tell us about yourselves and let's chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Naomi, for joining Forum Founders.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. It was such a pleasure.